This week, we discuss the different approaches to vulnerability management amongst ourselves. As we don't have a guest for that segment, we're going to do a topic on vulnerability management, which is, as you'll find, very timely. Then we jump straight into the enterprise security news, latent AI, Optiv Security launches managed XDR, an intriguing update to Mandiant Advantage, Reversing Labs raises $56 million, Morphisec announces a new incident response service, and more. Then we have back-to-back micro interviews from Black Hat 2021, Carolyn Solskar from Detectify, and TJ Null from Offensive Security. Stay tuned for all that and more on this episode of Enterprise Security Weekly. This is Security Weekly, for security professionals, by security professionals. Broadcasting live from G-Unit Studios in Rhode Island, it's the show where we talk security vendors and aren't afraid to name names. It's Enterprise Security Weekly. Wide-scale adoption of cloud applications, an increase in remote workers, and expansion of branch offices has rendered the centralized, on-premises security model impractical. Enter Cisco Umbrella. Umbrella now includes secure web gateway, firewall, and cloud access security broker functionality, plus integration with Cisco SD-WAN, all delivered from a single cloud security service. It helps businesses of all sizes secure their network and extend protection to roaming users and branch offices. Security doesn't have to be complicated. Get simple, smart, and powerful security with Cisco Umbrella. Visit securityweekly.com/Cisco Umbrella to learn more. Cybercriminals are using social engineering, loaded with urgency and fear, to successfully prey on victims, your employees, or your customers. Protect your Office 365 email from today's most sophisticated attacks with Barracuda Email Threat Scanner. It's a free tool to help protect your business from these hard-to-detect attacks. The Barracuda Email Threat Scanner uses artificial intelligence to hunt and eliminate Office 365 email threats. Find the cybersecurity threats hiding in your Office 365 email right now. Get your free email threat scan at securityweekly.com/Barracuda. Welcome, everyone, to episode number 238 of Enterprise Security Weekly. Today is August 11th, 2021. I'm your host, Paul Asadorian, joined remotely by Mr. Adrian Sanabria. Adrian, welcome.
Hey, should be a fun chat today.
Yes.
Some interesting news today. I'm looking forward to it.
Absolutely.
Also, Tyler's back.
Yes, Tyler's here. Tyler Shields is here with us as well. Tyler, welcome.
Afternoon, Paul. Thanks for the late addition to this week. I got back from Black Hat Conference last week and glad to be back with you guys.
Sweet. Outstanding. Security Weekly Unlocked will be held in person this December 5th through the 8th at the Hilton Lake Buena Vista. We're excited to announce our first round of speakers that includes David Kennedy, Alyssa Miller, O'Shea Bowens, Marina Chiavata, Patrick Cobble, Chris Eng, Eric Escobar, Kevin Johnson, and Justin Kohler. You can visit securityweekly.com/unlocked and register today. Also join us on August 26th at 11 a.m. Eastern Time to learn how to implement cloud security that actually works. This one's sponsored by Tanium, and it will be on August 11th. And really to focus on cloud, how to implement cloud stuff that actually works, which I think is a really good topic. If you missed any of our previous webcasts or technical trainings, of course, you can visit securityweekly.com/on-demand. The topic for today that we're going to discuss is around the different approaches to vulnerability management. I feel like it's been quite a journey. I'm kind of enamored for a couple of reasons with this topic, Adrian and Tyler. One, we're doing a group product review on vulnerability management right now as we speak. We've done a lot of evaluations of open source technologies, and we'll continue marching down the product technologies as well in this space. And I think, we've already learned a lot, even though we're kind of in the middle of it. I also am kind of enamored with, there's old and new problems, both of which I don't think we've really solved, right? I think there's still a challenge of how we identify all the assets that need to be scanned and do asset management correctly and accurately. I also think that another big topic is how we prioritize and remediate. And how we prioritize the remediation are still huge challenges today, not all that dissimilar from 20 plus years ago when we were talking about vulnerability management. Adrian, Tyler, turn over to you for initial thoughts. I kind of think I know where Tyler would go on this.
You know right position. Where I'm going to go. Yeah. Yeah, no, I mean, I think across the board, the biggest problem is knowing what you have. You don't know what you have, you can't fix it. You can't fix vulnerabilities and things you don't know that you have. So for me, cyber asset in the broadest sense of the word is the most important thing when it comes to discovering vulnerabilities. Now, if you understand what you've got, great. Look at it, assess it, look at the current state, look at the events emanating, and look for issues within all of that. But I think for my opinion, it tends to stem into knowing what you have. And then from there, actually, we mentioned it in the pre-show discussion that we were off air, a lot of the remediation really comes down to accountability. Without accountability for issues, people won't fix things, right? And so, knowing what you have, accountability on the back end, and then it just comes down to efficiency in the middle and how to figure out ways to make less false positives, lower false negatives, and actual true signal to the output, right? That's the key.
Yeah. It's an interesting... Go ahead, Adrian. Sorry, did you have a thought there?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know how much I should talk on this. I'm in danger of not stopping if I start. But certainly, if I'm to pick one thing that really irritates me, it's the lack of innovation that I think we've seen in kind of the traditional network vulnerability scanning space, particularly with what Tyler called out first and foremost is knowing what you have. And these scanners today are just still terrible at asset identification, accurate asset identification. So they'll come up and they'll say, yeah, it's running some form of Linux. But these days, that's not good enough. Like everything's running Linux. Like there's tons of IoT devices. There's, the Google Home devices on my network. The phones on my network are running Linux. It thinks my Ubiquity devices are Debian servers.
And don't forget, in the cloud with computing and/or containerization, much of that is based on Linux in some capacity. And I think when I talk to it's interesting. It doesn't matter what solution they have for Linux in the enterprise, but when I talk to the vendors that deal with Linux, they all tell the same story of a lot of organizations come to them or they go to them and they ask them, like, do you have Linux? And they're like, no. And they're like, well, okay, you deployed in AWS. And they're like, oh, wait, yeah, we do have Linux.
And there's no excuse for it these days. The reason I'm so harsh about it is my Ubiquity devices, the MAC address is Ubiquity. It's running proprietary Ubiquity services, that literally there's a TCP service or UDP service, I forget what it is, but you can basically ping it and it tells you exactly what device it is, what model, and like the firmware version on it. They couldn't make it easier to correctly identify this device. But for whatever reason, they just haven't kept up, and they're still using, the old ancient, which Nmap still uses, just looking at like TCP timing and sequence numbers and stuff like that to identify the operating system. And to make it worse, when you look at Rumble these days, in just like 18 short months, Rumble has made such huge leaps in improving asset identification. Supposedly, they've got an update coming out where just with an active network scan, they can tell what antivirus you're using on a host. Like they're doing amazing stuff and just, leapfrogging, the other folks who have been in the business, who are public companies, spend tons of money on research and supposed innovation.
Yeah.
And this,
but I think
HD Moore's tiny company is just like passed them overnight.
But I think that's an interesting, different approach, right? That maybe not everyone has realized is that we've historically relied on your vulnerability scanning vendors to do this asset, at least a portion of your asset identification.
True.
We need another project that comes before that to say, how are we going to identify assets and where are we going to look for those? And then when we find them, how do we operationalize it and what do we do with them? Right? That's back to your point, Tyler, right? Someone's got to be accountable for them. If you don't have that process in teams defined, then having a process that finds all your new hosts, like who are you telling about them and what are they supposed to do about them in what time frame?
Yeah, the other thing to think about too when we're talking about assets is when It's one thing to say IP addresses are assets. Great. Okay, we'll nmap, we'll run a Rumble scan, we'll do a whatever scan that looks for IP addresses and hosts, and we map all that. And you should map all that. You should know what's there. But it goes way beyond that because, if you start to think of assets as broader classes of assets, as identities, as repositories, as other things, you start to get a much broader sense of where vulnerabilities can exist. So take, for example, your cloud configuration. Your cloud configuration may have some IP addresses in it that represent some hosts. But literally, if you could get a login to the cloud configuration and look at the configuration from an internal vantage point, you may find vulnerabilities that aren't even attributable to an individual IP address, right?
Yeah.
Permissioning vulnerabilities, things like that. So I think the concept of vulnerability shouldn't be tied to an IP address. I think it should be tied to a broader sense of assets and looking at assets in a much broader way. And I don't think the current scanners do that. I think the current scanners are one piece of it, right?
Agreed.
Knowing what IP addresses you have are one piece of it. And a tool or a system like, if you want to talk open source, Neo4j is fantastic at being a centralized management system that you can pump all of that cyber asset data into and look at the relationships and how things interoperate. It's a free version. Go ahead and do it. Cartography, fantastic. Use it. It's free. But it just takes a little bit of engineering resources to date, and that's why those things haven't been drastically adopted all over the world.
Yeah, we can certainly attest to that on the open source front. Take some engineering to get there.
Yeah.
Which I mean is to be expected. But what I find interesting is when you start to develop policies that you want to enforce, essentially. I don't like using the word enforce, right? But we want to use softer language than that maybe in these discussions. But when I think of the attack vectors and how maybe I want to develop a policy that says, look, for any SaaS-based service that we have, if it can use our single sign-on system, it should. And our single sign-on system should have multi-factor authentication. And then anything else that doesn't support maybe our SSO should also have two-factor. Like so if we use our approach, how do we discover all of the SaaS services that we have and then identify which ones are supported by our single sign-on service and maybe which ones haven't been implemented in our single sign-on service, and then take the ones that aren't and make sure they have two-factor. Like that's a huge project in and of itself.
Yeah, and you're talking one asset class.
Right,
out of
exactly.
hundreds of different asset classes you need to secure. So I think, and I mentioned this before, I think a lot of that has to do with accountability of risk acceptance. It's one thing to design that project you just outlined, and it's fantastic the way you approached it. But what's going to happen when you've got that one tool that's mandatory for the business that doesn't do any kind of 2FA? Are you going to kick the tool out? Are you really going to say, hey, business, you're done. We're not going to do it. You can't. You have to accept that risk, right? And without accountability of vulnerabilities and tracking of them, you'll never accurately accept the risk. You'll just check the box, right? But the reality is somebody needs to be accountable. So if that system gets hacked, this person said, yes, we accept that risk, right? They need accountability. And I think that's the key thing to getting things done.
For sure. It is interesting, back to the network side of it, how Rumble is pretty amazing. And Adrian and I have already tested a bunch of tools for doing everything from asset management to vulnerability management to patch management. And I always come back to Rumble as my source of truth.
I love Rumble.
It's really amazing.
It's a fantastic tool.
So speaking of that, just to kind of outline things here, I don't know if we want to focus on any specific area here, but it might be worth mentioning just how broad vulnerability management is these days.
Absolutely.
Because you could actually look at the phases of a pen test in the past to get an idea of what vulnerability management looked like, because that's typically what you'd be paying a pen tester to go up against. Was and you group your assets into internal, external, which there'd be some overlap because you're essentially looking at the same assets from two different perspectives. But then you'd have OSINT assessments would be common, and that would be done just to make sure that maybe the client's missing some external assets. There's some assets they don't know about, and oftentimes you would find them. And that's its own entirely separate segment from vulnerability management today. That's attack surface discovery, monitoring, management, whatever you want to call it.
Yep.
But then you've got the, a web app assessment would be completely separate, from the internal assessment, the external assessment. A web application's a whole different deal because there's no database of vulnerabilities on your proprietary web application. Those have to be discovered potentially for the first time if you've never had anybody do a pen test against your web app. So any custom code you've written, that's a whole different assessment. And then all the libraries that are getting pulled into that, so AppSec has its own huge chunk of vulnerability management that didn't exist before. And now cloud also does, because it's introduced all these new asset classes. Now S3 buckets are an asset class, and serverless components are an asset class, and containers are an asset class, and code, publicly accessible code repos are an asset class. So as it grows, I think a lot of people haven't kept up with the technology in monitoring this stuff and staying aware of it and being able to discover it.
Yeah, there is an interesting degree of separation that you try and make between your IT assets and your other kind of infrastructure assets, right? We're kind of in the process of that at CRA. Like, okay, what is IT security? And then for the applications that we provide, that's like a totally different thing. We need a different approach, different tools, different processes, and different people are responsible for it.
And then how do you normalize the findings for prioritization across those different styles, right? Cloud, infrastructure, and AppSec. How do you normalize what makes something more risky? Is a cloud vuln more risky than an internal infrastructure vuln versus an AppSec vuln? And then deduplicating them. Do they cascade amongst classes? And I think like some of the vendors like Threadfix, Kenna, others have tried to solve some of this problem. I know Kenna at one point a couple years ago had added a AppSec module to their platform, and now Kenna's I think got bought by Cisco, if I recall correctly. So that combination of infrastructure, cloud, because they're going to play within the cloud selection or section of Cisco, plus the AppSec module. How do they go about normalizing it all? That's going to be a big problem as well.
Yeah, and it's interesting because I am talking to folks who are putting this all into one system, like Kenna or a Brinca or something like that.
Brinca, yep.
Yeah, and I even missed a few. Vulnerability disclosure and bug bounties, and then data leak detection are also categories of products and things that are now usually handled by whatever group handles vulnerability management these days.
And I think that's likely the greatest challenge. Is it's often not technically how we find these things or assess the vulnerabilities in them. It's what we do with them once we find them and how we prioritize them in several places, in one place, and getting to the point where someone can actually fix it, right? Has always been the struggle, spending all that time at Tenable. I would say that's probably still today the number one challenge that people have with vulnerability management is, technically we can find all of these things. It's how you build the systems and processes and policies so that the right stuff actually gets fixed in a timely manner. Yeah.
Somebody has to your point earlier, somebody has to own all those processes.
Yep.
And that's one of the nice things about, in the news later, we're going to talk about Intrigue getting acquired by Mandiant. And one of the interesting things there, generally the attack surface management category is interesting. But if you look at, Intrigue is open source, kind of the core of what they do is called Intrigue Core, and you can go look at it on GitHub. And really, they're using this huge group of open source applications. Like, there's one tool that does the DNS brute forcing, and another tool that looks for certain DNS vulnerabilities or configuration mistakes and things like that, and on and on and on. Looking for open S3 buckets, looking for data leaks. And traditionally, like when you'd have an OSINT assessment or something like that, there would be pen testers that maybe script all these tools together, but it wasn't until somebody built an enterprise product to do that you could really properly prepare for that kind of thing, without having to just manually find, incorporate, and run all these open source tools. So it's a lot to keep up with. And somebody's got to own that piece.
Yeah, and the ad hoc scanning doesn't scale, obviously, right? Because Adrian, you and I have cobbled some of these tools together and make them work, but if it's not working within a centralized process and in tools to get to the people that can fix the things,
if it's running on Joe's workstation when he thinks to run it, run the command line and maybe paste it into a spreadsheet somewhere like that. Yeah, no, it has to be operationalized like in such a way that it all goes into one place. So again, like a Brinqua or a Kenna, you need some system of record for all that stuff to go into. Maybe it's an Exonius or something like that.
Yeah, so it's interesting.
Jupiter One.
Yeah, Jupiter One would fit, Exonius would fit for sure. So what's interesting to me is, you guys see that Gartner, I don't know if you saw it, Gartner put out a report a week or two ago. They're calling this market CASM, CAASM, because that's exactly what we need, is another difficult to remember acronym. Cyber Asset Attack, CAASM, Cyber Asset Attack Surface Management. They basically jammed attack surface management with cyber asset management into a single unified market that included Exonius, Jupiter One, Intrigue, Sonray, and a couple of others. Which it's all the stuff we're dancing around. It's the unification of knowing what you have from a cyber asset standpoint, and then using that to understand what your threat landscape looks like. But if you read the wording of the report, it's literally all about cyber asset management, which appears to be the broader, all-encompassing kind of, I guess, version of the definition of that market.
So my initial reaction is the jokes are already starting to form in my mind. Chasm.
Oh yeah.
So I like it from that perspective. My other
you like it, but you like it because you can do jokes around it, Adrian?
Yes, I do. But I also don't like it because I really think it should be called external asset management. If we're going to have such a long descriptive.
Why external?
Because it is 100% external right now. None of this is doing, none of these vendors that are really associated with the term attack surface management are doing anything internal at all.
Right, which is why I struggle with the merger of those two terms. 100%.
What they've done is they've further confused it by mixing the two, but then keeping the familiar attack surface management piece. And it should all be asset discovery and asset management, and then broken down into, are you doing internal or external? Because every one of these companies, anybody getting into one of these products is going to be confused up to a certain point to where they realize, oh, this is mapping my internal stuff. Oh, this is mapping my external stuff.
That's right. Yep, I agree completely. That's my struggle. But if you read the report, it reads the way you're defining it, right? It reads as this global view of everything you have, internal, external combined. But the problem is they jam that attack surface management, which comes with the notion of outside in.
Nobody tell Gartner, but could you send me that?
I will not send it to you. I will not send it to you.
Yeah, it's interesting when we think about the different categories and how they're merging. And it comes down to, like, what do you need? So do I need to go find an attack surface management vendor? And then do I need to go find an asset management vendor? And then I have to go find a vulnerability management vendor. And then I have to go find a patching vendor. And how much can there be overlap in those four different categories for me to accomplish my goals? That's part of the challenge.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mentioned the acquisition of Intrigue into Mandiant. So far we haven't seen an acquisition. Risk IQ went to Microsoft, and Expanse went to Palo Alto. So we haven't seen an acquisition by a traditional vulnerability management vendor.
Oh, didn't Rapid7 buy someone? Rapid7 bought one.
Did they?
Yeah.
Did I miss that?
Yeah. Who'd they buy? They bought someone. I think that was the only example that we could come up with.
Insights.
Yes.
Yes, you're correct. They did buy Insights. Okay, I'm wrong. well, at least, and where I was going with this is now with 3 or actually 4, including Insights, this is going to go like CASB. I think CASB vendors popped up, start coming out of stealth, and 3 years later, maybe the majority of the market was acquired, and I think this market's going to go the same way.
Yeah, because I want less vendors, not more.
Yes. It needs to be consolidated. I mean, it's cool if they can import from that tool, but from an overhead and a management perspective, you don't want more security vendors. You want less.
Yeah,
we've been talking about that all year, where the more vendors you have to manage, the more overhead you have, and literally we've seen the studies that say you get a worse security outcome the more vendors you have.
Right. Be interesting to see who those vendors emerge with a more unified platform to accomplish these goals and solve the challenges of essentially what comes down to vulnerability management. And I use the term vulnerability kind of loosely in there. It could be that if I have this particular asset, whether it's in the cloud or whether it's a physical system or whatever it is, just the fact I have that could be a finding and potentially a vulnerability.
Yeah, and they, I hope they're not all separate modules either. Like to me, this is, what a lot of the more mature attack surface monitoring or management vendors are doing, like Psycognito and Rendori and some of those folks, and to an extent, Intrigue and Bit Discovery is going in that direction also. What they're doing can almost replace existing external vulnerability scanning tools already. So this should not be, I should not have to pay extra for this. It should not be an extra module. This is just how external scanning should be done now.
Right. Yeah, and it's interesting how there's patch management and vulnerability management. Now those lines are being blurred, which I think is a good thing. I like Qualys' approach to, hey, if we're going to find it, we're going to just help you fix it too, right? I think there's nothing wrong with that approach.
I think the main challenge you run into there is those are generally different groups doing that, right?
Yeah. Yep.
Yeah.
It comes down to people.
So sometimes it gets tricky. Like who buys the tool? Does it come out of IT's budget or does it come out of, security budget?
Mm-hmm.
But they both need access into it.
Yeah. And what's the difference between patch management and vulnerability management in that respect? If there's a tool that I have an agent that goes on my systems that tells me, hey, you're missing updates, right? It can tell whether those are security or not, and it allows me to manage that. How is that different?
It's the same question as what's the difference between a bug and an application security flaw in your web app?
Right.
The intent of the attacker.
Yeah.
Well, and I think more directly to your question, Paul, it has to do with which piece of software is actually pushing those patches, and where the folks log in, to push a button to make that happen, or where it's fully automated out of. So a lot of it's where the decision is made, I think.
Mm-hmm.
Who has control over that? Does security get to say when the patch goes? Do they get final say? Generally it's going to be the asset owners who are not the security folks.
Right. Yeah, I like to see both teams on the same platform because I think it makes it easier to integrate, maybe not more advanced, but other things such as breach and attack simulation more easily. If they're all on the same platform, I like the approach of treating, you're going to treat your IT-based systems similar to the way we treat applications, in that we're going to find stuff, we're going to fix stuff, and then we're going to run simulations. And when those are successful, we're going to fix the gaps that they're finding. I think that's the only way you can be more resilient today, is if you have those processes.
Because then they can be on the same page, and they can be, they can love one another and get along better. And
I agree.
We can have some healing, and we can, sit down, sing, eat lunch together.
Well, and I think it helps with the priority too, because the vuln scanner is going to tell you about everything that you're missing, but the breach and attack is going to go, no, we used these 2 misconfigurations in this vulnerability to accomplish a goal. Let's go fix those things. I think that really helps priority.
Here's to me the most interesting thing about cyber asset management and governance systems like Jupiter One, Exonius, even to a degree Intrigue, and things that were outside in focused, right? What they provide is connectivity between all your assets, the relationships amongst them, but specifically they provide, on the back of all that analysis, context that levels up every part of your cybersecurity program. So the context that comes from knowing what you have and how it all operates levels up incident response and incident handling. It levels up vulnerability management. It levels up compliance, right? It levels up literally any security use case you can imagine via the context you get from those relationships and asset understanding. So that, to me, is what's really exciting about this chasm market.
I really like Vicarius positioned in this mix as well, and to solve this problem, because what they have built is a system that gives me an inventory. Again, I got to know about the stuff, right? And put the agent on it. Tells me what's on that device. It tells me about vulnerabilities. It can patch things, and it can do what they call patchless, right? But it can put in-memory protections for those things. But the lens that they look at vulnerabilities, I thought, was a very novel approach, because they brought together many data points that you may not often consider. And we went through exercises on Paul Security Weekly doing this, right? And it was about, okay, there's a vulnerability in Firefox. Well, how exploitable is it is just one thing, but how many workstations are running it? Who owns those workstations? How often is it used? And it allows you to make smart decisions. If there's something that people are using, it's in the approved list, then we better patch it, or maybe put memory protections around it, or both, right? And I thought their approach was really sound. Now, they're biting off a lot, in the market, right? But I think that's what we need in this space is someone to take on all of these challenges.
Well, you're still going to have different workflows for different things, though, right? Like the CSPM vendors, are kind of going after the the DevOps workflow, and AppSec is going to have a different workflow. Like oftentimes, maybe for security, for just having like a good overall view of things, you want 100% of everything in one place, so you can prioritize. You can look at your general risk, but the people actually, fixing these bugs, making these changes, there's going to be several different workflows, and it's not a bad thing. I don't think you can. I'm not sure if it's ever going to be feasible to create one system that has the workflow for discovering, assigning, and triaging vulnerabilities in all cases.
Yeah, agree. AppSec is a totally different segment in discussion, right?
Yeah, like if you're deploying a container and there's a critical vulnerability in a container, that's part of an automated workflow. Somebody gets a Slack message that, hey, the container didn't go to production, and here's why. Very different, from how you're going to patch a Windows workstation or, a Linux server or something like that in a more traditional IT environment.
Yeah, no, you're right. There is a really big difference there, because I can stop the build in an AppSec sense, but in an IT sense, I can't. There's no breaking of the build process, right? Like Firefox is already deployed, it's already vulnerable. There's nothing else I can do about it but patch it, right?
But when talking about the traditional space, I think one of the questions there is interesting. Something I'm unsure of. And that's kind of the order of the workflow. Like should we be starting with a network vulnerability scan? Because I've seen some organizations that kind of start with the asset discovery, and then they build that asset software, asset database of what tools and what software they have in their environment, and then they set up a system where they get notified anytime there's a vulnerability related to that software, instead of looking at the results from a vulnerability scan, which tend to be, even sometimes if they're credentialed scans, have a high number of false positives, that you have to dig through. And I wonder which approach is really, and maybe one works better in smaller environments, one works better in larger environments. But I think it's an interesting problem.
For sure. Well, hopefully we provided some answers during this segment for folks and got everyone thinking about it. So coming up, we'll be talking about some ad hoc scanning in some more technical segments, and we'll be reporting back on the results from our vulnerability management testing in the coming weeks. So stay tuned. With that, we're going to take a short break and talk about the enterprise security news for this week.